My sister always chose my brother over me, and there was a reason behind all this. My name is Charlotte, and I am from Denver. This is not a story I ever planned to tell out loud, because for most of my life, I believed it was my responsibility to stay quiet. I believed that silence was the price I had to pay to belong. When you grow up feeling like you were chosen last, even inside your own family, you learn very early how to shrink yourself. You learn how to observe instead of participate, how to listen instead of speak, and how to accept love in fragments rather than expecting it fully. I was adopted first. My parents struggled with infertility for years before they brought me home. I was their miracle, their answered prayer, the child they were told they might never have. I have seen the photos. My mother's smile in those pictures looks real, hopeful, almost relieved. My father's hands always rested protectively on my tiny shoulders. In those early years, I truly believed they loved me the best way they knew how. At least, that is what I tell myself now, because the alternative hurts too much to sit with for long. A few years later, my mother conceived naturally. My brother was born, and everything shifted in ways I did not yet have words for. People say children are too young to notice these things, but that is not true. Children notice everything. They notice tone changes, longer hugs, softer voices, and eyes that light up differently. When my brother arrived, the house felt louder, warmer, fuller. It also felt like I had become something extra rather than essential. Then my sister was born. She was their second biological child, and from the moment she could walk, she belonged in a way I never fully did. She had my mother's eyes and my father's smile. My brother had my father's confidence and my mother's pride. I had none of those familiar reflections. I was the child people described as sweet or quiet, which I later learned were polite ways of saying I did not quite fit. Growing up, the favoritism was not always obvious, but it was consistent. My brother was praised for his intelligence, even when he barely tried. My sister was admired for her personality, her charm, her natural ease around others. I was compared to them constantly, not directly, but through small comments that stacked up over time. They would say things like, "Your brother is just naturally sharp," or "Your sister has such strong social skills." When it came to me, they would say, "Charlotte tries very hard," as if effort itself was proof that something essential was missing. My sister and brother became a unit early on. They played together, laughed together, and shared inside jokes that I was never invited into. When I tried to join, they would tell me I ruined the game or did not understand the rules. Sometimes they said it kindly, sometimes they did not bother pretending. They told me they did not enjoy playing with me because I was not good at it. I remember standing nearby, pretending I was busy with something else, while wishing desperately that someone would tell them to include me anyway. My parents rarely intervened. When I brought it up, I was told not to be sensitive or to stop imagining things. My mother would say that siblings fight and that I needed to be stronger. My father would laugh it off and say my brother and sister just had more in common. No one ever asked how it felt to always be the one left out. No one ever asked why I always seemed quieter after family gatherings. As we grew older, the discrimination evolved. It became less about games and more about identity. My brother was praised for his mental strength, his resilience, his leadership. My sister was admired for her beauty, her confidence, her emotional intelligence. I was measured against both and found lacking in different ways. If I was sensitive, I was told I needed to toughen up. If I stayed quiet, I was told I needed to speak more. If I spoke up, I was told I was overreacting. Sometimes the bullying was direct. My sister would comment on my facial features, pointing out how different I looked from everyone else. Other times it was indirect, wrapped in humor or sarcasm. She and my brother would exchange looks when I spoke, or laugh quietly after I left the room. Even when the comments were small, they landed heavily because they confirmed what I already feared, that I was fundamentally different and therefore easier to dismiss. The hardest part was when my parents joined in, especially during my childhood. They did not intend to be cruel, but intention does not erase impact. When my brother succeeded, it was celebrated loudly. When my sister excelled, it was admired openly. When I achieved something, it was acknowledged briefly before the focus shifted back to them. I learned not to expect applause. I learned to congratulate others even when my own accomplishments went unnoticed. Despite all of this, they were my world. That is the part people struggle to understand. I did not hate my family. I loved them fiercely. I still do. They were the only family I knew, the only place I belonged, even if that belonging felt conditional. I told myself that being adopted meant I had to be grateful, that I owed them for choosing me. Gratitude became a cage I locked myself inside. When my father passed away, everything became quieter, but not necessarily kinder. Grief reshapes families in unpredictable ways. My mother changed after his death. On the surface, she became warmer toward me. She started introducing me as her firstborn, speaking proudly of the day she brought me home. To others, it probably looked like healing. To me, it felt confusing. The words said one thing, but her eyes said another. I could still see the difference. When my brother walked into a room, her face softened in a way I had never seen directed at me. When my sister laughed, my mother lit up, as if that sound alone could restore something she had lost. With me, her affection felt deliberate, almost practiced. I appreciated the effort, but I could feel the gap between intention and instinct. My sister continued to choose my brother in subtle and obvious ways. She sided with him in disagreements, defended him even when he was wrong, and dismissed my feelings as exaggerations. They shared a bond rooted in shared blood and shared history, one I was never truly invited into. When I tried to explain how it made me feel, I was told I was holding on to the past or refusing to move on. There were moments when I questioned myself. I wondered if I was imagining the distance, if my insecurity was coloring my perception. But patterns do not lie. Years of being overlooked, minimized, and compared leave marks that are difficult to erase. I became hyper-aware of tone, expressions, and pauses. I learned to read between lines because what was unsaid often mattered more than what was spoken. By adulthood, I had mastered the art of emotional self-containment. I stopped asking for inclusion. I stopped expecting fairness. I became independent not because I wanted to be, but because it was safer to rely on myself. I built a life that did not require approval, even though part of me still longed for it. People often say adoption is beautiful, and it is. But it can also be complicated in ways few talk about. Being chosen does not guarantee being equal. Being loved does not mean being understood. I grew up grateful and wounded at the same time, carrying both truths in silence. This is not a story about villains. My sister is not cruel by nature. My brother is not intentionally heartless. My mother is not incapable of love. This is a story about dynamics, about unspoken hierarchies, about how biology quietly shapes belonging even when no one admits it out loud. It is about how children absorb messages long before they can articulate them. For years, I believed the reason my sister always chose my brother was because there was something wrong with me. I believed that if I were smarter, stronger, or more like them, things would be different. It took a long time to understand that the reason was never my inadequacy. The reason was simply that I was different in a family that valued sameness more than they realized. And that understanding did not come easily. It came through loneliness, reflection, and years of learning to name my pain without apologizing for it. It came through accepting that love can exist alongside favoritism, and that both can be real at the same time. This is where my story truly begins, not with adoption or exclusion, but with the moment I stopped blaming myself for a dynamic I did not create. Because once I understood the reason, I had to decide what to do with it. And that decision changed everything. Once I stopped blaming myself, I was left with something far more difficult to face: the truth that understanding does not automatically heal what has been broken. Knowing the reason my sister always chose my brother did not suddenly erase the years of exclusion, nor did it rewrite the memories that had already settled deep inside me. Instead, it forced me to confront the quiet grief of realizing that some wounds are formed not by a single moment, but by a lifetime of being almost loved, almost included, and almost enough. I began to see how deeply those early dynamics had shaped me. I noticed how I apologized before speaking, how I softened my opinions before sharing them, how I instinctively made space for others while minimizing my own needs. These habits did not come from politeness or humility. They came from survival. They were learned responses to growing up in a family where asserting myself often meant risking rejection or ridicule. Independence had become my armor, but it was also my isolation. As an adult, I tried to create distance without fully cutting ties. I moved forward with my life, built routines that belonged only to me, and surrounded myself with people who knew nothing of my family history. With friends and colleagues, I was different. I was more confident, more expressive, more present. Yet every time I returned home, I felt myself shrinking back into the version of Charlotte that had learned how to disappear quietly. My sister remained close to my brother, and their bond only grew stronger with time. They spoke frequently, supported each other's choices, and shared milestones in ways that excluded me without ever explicitly saying so. I was invited but never central, included but never essential. When family decisions were made, I was informed after the fact, as if my role was to accept rather than contribute. There were moments when I considered confronting them directly. I rehearsed conversations in my head, imagining myself calmly explaining how years of favoritism had affected me. But every time I pictured the outcome, I saw the same pattern repeating: minimization, deflection, the suggestion that I was being too emotional or too focused on the past. I realized that seeking validation from people who had never fully acknowledged my pain would only reopen wounds rather than heal them. My mother continued her quiet performance of closeness. She spoke warmly to me, checked in more often, and made a visible effort to show affection. I wanted to believe her actions were genuine, and part of me still does. But I could not ignore the way her attention gravitated naturally toward my brother and sister. It was not something she chose consciously. It was something ingrained, something instinctive. And that realization hurt more than any harsh word ever could. Grief complicated everything. Losing my father had created a shared loss, but it also highlighted old divides. My brother became my mother's anchor, her source of stability and continuity. My sister became her emotional mirror. I became her responsibility, the child she felt she needed to reassure, perhaps to compensate for something she sensed but never fully addressed. Love, when mixed with guilt, carries a different weight. For a long time, I tried to earn my place by being exceptional. I overachieved in ways that were invisible to them but demanding to me. I prided myself on resilience, on not needing help, on handling everything alone. People praised my strength without realizing it had been forged by neglect rather than encouragement. I learned that strength can be admired while still being lonely. Eventually, something shifted, not dramatically, but gradually. I started questioning why I continued to measure my worth through their eyes. I asked myself what it would mean to define family on my own terms, rather than clinging to a version that had never fully included me. These questions were uncomfortable, but they were necessary. Healing does not begin with answers. It begins with honest questions. I began setting emotional boundaries, small ones at first. I stopped explaining myself when my feelings were dismissed. I stopped volunteering for roles that kept me on the margins. I allowed myself to step back without guilt, to decline invitations that felt obligatory rather than welcoming. Each boundary felt like a betrayal at first, because I had been conditioned to believe that endurance was love. But slowly, I learned that protecting myself was not abandonment, it was self-respect. My relationship with my sister changed subtly. I no longer sought her approval or chased her inclusion. I spoke to her as an equal, not as someone asking to be chosen. She noticed the shift, though she never named it. Our interactions became more distant, but also more honest. I stopped pretending that her choices did not affect me, and in doing so, I stopped letting them define me. With my brother, the distance remained. He was not unkind, just unaware. His life had unfolded without the constant question of belonging. I realized that expecting him to understand my experience was unfair, not because my pain was invalid, but because he had never been asked to see the world from my position. Accepting that freed me from resentment I had carried quietly for years. The most complex relationship to navigate was the one I had with myself. I had internalized the belief that I was secondary, that my role was to adapt rather than assert. Undoing that belief required patience and compassion I had never extended inward before. I began acknowledging my own grief, not as weakness, but as evidence of how deeply I had loved despite being hurt. I also began to reframe my adoption story. For years, it had felt like the reason for my exclusion, the invisible line that separated me from my siblings. But I started to see it differently. Adoption had made me observant, empathetic, and emotionally aware. It had taught me to read rooms, to understand nuance, to value connection deeply. These traits were not flaws. They were strengths forged in adversity. There were moments of anger along the way. Anger at my parents for not protecting me more fiercely. Anger at my sister for choosing convenience over compassion. Anger at myself for staying silent for so long. I learned to let that anger exist without letting it consume me. Anger, when acknowledged, becomes information rather than destruction. I did not confront my family in a dramatic way. There was no single conversation that changed everything. Instead, there was a quiet recalibration. I adjusted my expectations. I accepted that my family might never fully understand the impact of their actions, and that waiting for that understanding was keeping me stuck. Acceptance did not mean approval. It meant release. Over time, I built a chosen family, people who saw me without comparison, who valued me without conditions, who did not require me to compete for space. With them, I learned what it felt like to be included naturally, without effort or explanation. Their presence did not erase my past, but it softened its hold on me. Today, when I look back, I no longer see myself as the child who was always left out. I see a woman who learned to stand alone when necessary, who developed depth through difficulty, and who understands love in complex, layered ways. My sister choosing my brother was never a reflection of my worth. It was a reflection of a family dynamic shaped by biology, grief, and unexamined habits. I still love my family. That truth has not changed. Love does not disappear simply because it is imperfect. But I love myself differently now, with more honesty and less apology. I no longer chase moments that leave me feeling small. I no longer confuse tolerance with belonging. If there is one thing I wish someone had told me earlier, it is this. Being adopted did not make me less deserving of love. Being different did not make me inferior. And being overlooked did not mean I was invisible. It only meant that I had been looking for recognition in places that were not equipped to give it. This story is not about bitterness. It is about clarity. It is about understanding that reasons explain behavior, but they do not excuse harm. It is about choosing growth over resentment and self-respect over silent endurance. My sister always chose my brother, and now I understand why. But today, I chose myself. If this story resonated with you, share it with someone who might need to hear it. Your support helps more voices be heard.